If we do have a designer, what is this designer? John and I, before we came in, as two old men tend to do, we were swapping stories about, I'm more gravely ill than you are, sort of thing. I'm going to collapse on stage before you do. But let's take something that neither of us brought up, hemorrhoids. My father had them. I can't believe that any God who cared a bit about human beings would have invented a world which allowed hemorrhoids. So I think if you're going to get into design, then you've got to take the rough with the smooth, as it were. And so I think there are all sorts of issues like that.
There's three issues to get us going.
See, he's cutting me off. He's cutting me off already.
I
was told not to bring those sorts of examples up.
Well, if you're happy, shall we start at least with one of those and see where?
I'd like to start with all three.
It's this question of why, if it's a designer, why hemorrhoids? So yes,
right.
The hemorrhoids point, because I think this is.
We always want to get to the bottom of these things. Oh my God! What an awful.
Oh dear. Right. So, John, joking aside, this is an important question. It fundamentally boils down to, if you do believe there's a designer behind the whole show, why are there so many awful things in the world? And that's a question that's been asked since, time immemorial, isn't it? Where do you want to begin with that one, coming at it from, a scientist's point of view?
Well, this is a huge question, of course, but the first point I would make is there are two separate questions. There's the recognition that there's a mind behind the universe. That's one question. And I believe that science can tell us something about that. But then there's a second question. Who is behind the universe? And what is his character and what is his nature? Now, when it comes to the question of evil, moral evil and natural evil, I think about this a lot because I find it's the hardest question for any of us. There's no two ways about it. And if you want a short response, it'll have to be short. My approach to it is, first of all, it seems to me atheism doesn't solve it. It solves it in an intellectual sense, that people say, like Dawkins, the universe is just like you'd expect it to be. When at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, and we just have to face it. Well, if that is correct, of course, it means you've solved the problem. You've removed it in some sense, but what you haven't removed is the suffering and the pain. So I find that philosophically a disaster. But now, in order to respond to it as a Christian, I have to come down to the heart of the Christian faith. And this is the very short answer. At the heart of the Christian faith there stands a cross. And if that really is God there, then it tells me that God hasn't remained distant from this problem, but has himself become part of it. And the cross and the resurrection together seem to me to do what atheism's solution to this problem doesn't do. They give us grounds for hope. And I face a universe, as Michael does, that presents a mixed picture. It's like a ruined cathedral, Coventry Cathedral. You can see traces of beauty and you can see the marks of bombs. I call it beauty and barbed wire. And whatever our philosophy is or our worldview, we have to cope with that because that's the reality. And the only way that I can see a window into it, I can't solve it, I wouldn't pretend to, or insult anybody's suffering by so doing. I've been to Auschwitz many times and wept every time. But I would say this, we will never solve the problem philosophically of what a good God should, would, might, could, etc. have done. So we've got a problem. And as a mathematician, if you can't solve one problem, you ask a different one. And the different question for me is, granted that it's like that, is there anywhere in the universe evidence that there's a God that we could trust with it? And I believe there is, as revealed in Jesus Christ. That's my short answer.
Okay.
Thank goodness we didn't get the long one. Sorry, that was uncalled for.
But Michael, I suppose at this point John does turn to his Christian faith in a rather direct way, in the way that you were hoping he would earlier in a way. The point is that, yes, ultimately this is a question which isn't going to be necessarily answered by science, but it can be answered by a revelation of Jesus Christ. What's your response to that?
I'm okay with the revelation part. First of all, I think I want to say that I agree with John that, there's two things I think we agree about. One is that these are genuine questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Is there a purpose to the universe? I think a lot of my fellow philosophers following Wittgenstein would say that these are not genuine questions, that they can't be answered, so anything which can't be answered in principle can't be a genuine question in the first place. I think that's nonsense. Of all people, I'm with Heidegger on this. I think why is there something rather than nothing is the fundamental question of metaphysics. The second thing is, and I think, again, I agree very much with John on this, is that these are not questions to be answered by science. I mean, I talked about metaphor, and as I say, I think the metaphor that we've got at some level drains out questions like, why is there something rather than nothing? What is the nature of morality? Is there a purpose to the universe? I think the whole metaphor that we've got of the machine, which is just following laws and just going round and round like a clock, is one which excludes these questions. It doesn't mean that they can't be answered, and I think it's perfectly legitimate for Christians to offer their answers. The universe exists because it was made by a good God. Morality, in some sense, is following the will of God. The purpose is eternal salvation with our Creator. So I think these are legitimate answers, but I think they're open to theological and philosophical criticism. And John's mentioned the problem, we're both mentioning the problem of evil. You see, this is where I have trouble here. The usual answer about the problem of moral evil, I'm not talking about the Lisbon earthquake now, I'm talking about Auschwitz. The usual answer is that God gave us free will, and the implication of that was that some people would misuse this. All I can say is, I just don't see how you could possibly say we've got a good God who gave Heinrich Himmler free will and thought it was more important to give Heinrich Himmler free will than to let Anne Frank die of cholera or typhoid rather in Bergen-Belsen. If that's the cost of getting a universe going, I don't want any part of it. Anybody who says to me, at least in any evidential way, that yes, I think we can make progress to belief in a good God, I want to say, I just don't know how you can balance the free will of Heinrich Himmler against the death of Anne Frank or Sophie Scholl or any of these others. I don't want a God of that kind at all. Now, if you want to say to me, but by revelation, I believe in a God who will make it possible, I think that's a legitimate position to take. It's not mine because I've not had the revelation. But this again goes right back to where I think John and I have got a very fundamental disagreement about the evidential basis of Christianity.
A response to that?
I don't think John's position is stupid. I think it's wrong.
Oh, right, sure. Well, that's something.
Well, I would reciprocate with great affection. I think that I would sit where you sit, Michael, if I didn't believe in the final judgment. I don't think Himmler is going to get away with it. That's the one side. And secondly, however strange it may seem to you, I think that God is a God who knows how to compensate. And it's because of that and the resurrection of Christ and the promise of the future that I sometimes dare to think that when we see what God eventually does with the Anne Franks of this world, we mightn't have such severe questions. But you know, Michael, the thing that weighs most with me is not whether my beliefs help me, it's whether they're true or not. I've had, ever since a child, I've had a passion about truth. And at Cambridge, a Nobel Prize winner, and this was the turning point in my life. Having spoken to him at dinner, he took me up to his room and 3 other professors around. He said, "Lennox, do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." Well, he said, "In front of witnesses tonight, give up this childish belief in God. It'll cripple you. It will completely throw you out of the running." And he offered me some solution. I said, "What have you got to offer me that's better than what I've already got?" And that put steel into me somehow. I thought, if ever I get the chance to go before the public as a scientist, I want to try to do what we've done tonight. And that is to put out into the public space 2 sides of the argument and let people make up their own minds. But that moved me deeply, and I couldn't help thinking, if he'd been a Christian and I'd been an atheist, he'd have been out of the university the next day. But that was my first experience of the pressure coming from that particular person.
Well, I think you're a better Christian than you let on, John. Because it does seem to me that, by and large, the evidence is not swaying you. I don't know how you could get better evidence of the iffy nature of God's personality to say the free will of Heinrich Himmler is more important than the suffering and death of Anne Frank. Now, if you come at it from a faith-based thing and say, I'm trying to put it in perspective with my already given conviction, my knowledge, if you like, that God exists and is loving, and then I've got to interpret, I think that's one thing. But to say, oh no, I'm working on an evidential basis. I believe in God because of the design rather than design because of God. That's where
I wasn't allowed to comment.
I just don't think you're doing that anymore.
Well, let's have one final comment and we must go to some questions.
Yes, I take the argument for design in both directions, not only in one direction. I think of the alternatives. And the main alternative, God could solve that very easily by making us all robots who were entirely deterministic. But what that would do is empty the world of human beings. You and I wouldn't be in that world for the simple reason that, having been given to some extent a freedom of choice, we are capable of love. Now, when I have children and grandchildren, and I remember bringing my first child into the world and holding this little girl and saying, do you know, you could grow up to disown me and rebel against me. Why would anybody have children? And I think that God faced a similar problem. We have children because of the potential for love, but we know it can go wrong, but it can only go wrong because the potential for love is there. Now, I admit that problems like Himmler and Anne Frank are terrible problems, but if you solve them by saying God ought to have made us robots so that there was no love in the universe, well, that would make me think very hard in the opposite direction.
Perhaps we'll get a chance to chase that up during the Q&A. For the moment, would you give a round of applause for both our guests?